Napoli country and
Sorry, it was muted. Oh.
These little excitements do a lot for your flow and your concentration and your ability to do this talk. Okay, it's widely recognised, as these quotes from the current review of the Aboriginal Heritage Act show, that the definition of sites within the Heritage Act does not adequately represent First Nations perspectives, which focus much more on landscapes and connections between places and include tangible and intangible values. The fact is, however, that both intangible values and cultural landscapes are a lot harder to accommodate within a bureaucratic system than clearly defined dots on maps, or more commonly these days, GPS-determined polygons with clearly marked boundaries. And it's a bureaucratic system, moreover, that is focused primarily on approvals and facilitating access to land for development, rather than the celebration, investigation and promotion of WA's First Nations rich heritage. And it's right and proper that issues relating to the proper acknowledgement of the rights and well-being of Aboriginal people and their perspectives are addressed in relation to their heritage and through legislation. Here I want to talk as an archaeologist about how the archaeological aspects of Aboriginal heritage are badly served by the current compliance system. I'm going to talk primarily from a compliance perspective. It's been fabulously encouraging to see the projects that were presented this morning that are really taking on the challenges of incorporating Indigenous perspectives and incorporating landscape perspectives. But it's something that's a lot harder to do in the actual bread and butter compliance process that goes on as part of your average heritage consultant's everyday work. Nevertheless, if we also rise to those challenges, I believe that we would do archaeology a lot better. As we've heard this morning, also, archaeological sites provide a unique record relating to the rich and diverse ways of living in this continent, dating back 50,000 years and more. A record that is fragile, endangered, often subtle and elusive, and calls for specialist skills to recover and to interpret. A record that new and developing archaeological methods and theoretical insights continues to reveal and will continue to reveal as those methods develop, from a continental scale right down to little local perspectives. The work of archaeologists in relation to the regulatory requirements of the site register is mostly dominated by site recording, putting dots on maps. More specifically, this work involves determining boundaries around what we can call sites, and then assessing the importance or significance of those so-called sites. Are they proper sites worthy of record on the site's register, or perhaps other heritage places of little or no importance? Should they be more carefully investigated, or can we just let them go? And by implication, we also define areas of empty space which do not have sites. However, none of this is really archaeology, although the process does make use of archaeological skills and techniques. Archaeology is about understanding the lives of past people through the material evidence they leave behind. And much of this work of site recording contributes relatively little to that larger understanding of how First Nations people have inhabited this land from ancient to recent times. Sometimes, if a site is very old perhaps, it may be viewed a bit differently and cherry-picked for further investigation, but most archaeological sites are largely expendable and receive very little systematic attention beyond that original site recording process. In fact, it's quite difficult to find anything much on the DPLH website that mentions Aboriginal archaeological sites. And what it does say is not particularly helpful or informative, and is even dismissive. The greatest quantity of stone artefacts at most locations is the debris or waste material from production of a specific tool. the subtext is that it's rubbish. It would be nice to think that stone artefacts can be divided neatly into tools and waste, but everything we know about stone artefacts from decades of archaeological study tells us that actually waste flakes were frequently used. Sites with stone artefacts include a mixture of tools with short use lives, made, used and discarded on the spot, and tools with long use lives, often made elsewhere, as well as the complete record of the production, of the acquisition of raw material, production and discard of that whole process. The two broad categories of artefact, short use lives and long use lives, provide very different types of information in terms of their relationship to the landscape in which they're found. Local information used on the spot, or large-scale regional connections used at many different locations and carried as personal gear before being discarded. The point here is that all the artefacts, including the so-called waste, carry information about how people in the past used the landscape, where they passed through, where they visited repeatedly, and how they used the resources of the landscape, and particularly how they used the stone resources of the landscape, and how they distributed those resources through their social systems. We can be sometimes very specific about this, where stone can be identified as coming from particular sources, where it's used for particular purposes. But even where stone is being used purely locally, still its distribution and how it was used is much more informative than rubbish and a simple message that people were here. So what about the places where we find these artifacts? How do these places connect to each other and to the landscapes in which they are found, and how can we interpret them in that context? How can we read these places? How might understanding the archaeology in this way affect how we, as site recorders, as consultant archaeologists, interpret sites? Recording sites and drawing boundaries around them is a deceptively complex business. In this example here of a complex site in Napoli country, we have a rocky hillock that overlooks a small, fairly patchy surface artifact scatter. In the side of the hill, there are two small rock shelters, which are themselves quite tiny, really too small for use. But in one of these, stones were placed to block off two openings. And within the shelter was recorded a hammerstone, a core, and a single flake. And immediately outside the shelter, there were two more hammerstones. So a very specialised and specific toolkit. On the plateau immediately above these shelters is a stone arrangement and surface artefacts. In this particular case, these different individual components have been recorded as a single site, but they could easily, by somebody else, have been recorded as different sites. The point is that how we put boundaries around sites and how we connect these things that we find in space is a decision. And how that decision is made has implications for assigning significance and the nature of archaeological investigation that is subsequently deemed appropriate. And in fact, if we pull back and take a larger view of the landscape where this particular site occurs, the orange circle is around 500 metres around the site. So within 500 metres of it, there are numerous isolated artefacts, as well as other surface scatters and a couple of quarries. Where in this landscape should the boundaries be drawn? Are there many dots, or should we connect them and make a single large space? This may sound a little trivial, but actually whether we take this narrow reductionist view or take an integrated approach to the whole area has real implications for how we interpret the archaeology, and the decisions about where to draw boundaries may have serious implications for how these sites are assessed down the track and what gets put on the site register. To put it crudely, it's a lot easier to dismiss a lot of little sites as trivial or insignificant if development is your primary goal. So to look a bit more at some other landscapes and archaeology in Napoli country, the archaeology of these landscapes, including the example I was just talking about, was recorded on FMG's Cloudbreak Christmas Creek project as part of compliance archaeology by heritage teams, including Napoli traditional owners, archaeologists from Archaeos and FMG heritage officers. And I'd like to acknowledge all those for the data they collected and the support that made additional analysis of the data possible. So I'll make it clear this is not one of those whiz-bang projects in the first half. This is bread and butter compliance archaeology. So the Christmas Creek project is in the foothills of the Chichester Range, and its landscapes include the ephemeral creek lines and gullies that drain the ranges. These creeks drain into the alluvial plains, which carry primarily mulga woodlands, and eventually into the Fortescue Marsh and the waterholes, the Yinta, along its northern edge. I stress I'm taking an archaeological perspective here, and I'm not speaking for Napoli people. However, Napoli people compare the flow of water through these landscapes, through the creek lines, to the flow of blood through the body. Water is the lifeblood of this country. There are various types of archaeological sites in this area, including rock shelters, some with stratified archaeological deposits, others with stone structures and other cultural material, as the example we've seen before. There are quarries, there are scarred trees, and like much of the rest of Western Australia, the most common manifestation of Aboriginal activity in this landscape is surface scatters of stone artefacts. These are the archaeological sites on the register, basically. The small black triangles, I hope are visible, are rock shelters, and all the red blobs and dots are artefact scatters of varying sizes. We look at the distribution of recorded sites in this area, and the connection to water is clear at this sort of bird's eye view of the landscape. Artefact scatters tend to align along creek lines, and also there are linear arrangements of artefact scatters which we would assume relate to older creek channels, older versions of the landscape that are no longer evident. But, as I mentioned before, this patchy looking distribution is not the whole story. We can add many more dots to this map. There are thousands of small artefact scatters and individual artefacts across this landscape. And the boundaries of all these registered sites could be drawn in many, many different ways. When we analyse and compare the big sites and the little sites and the individual artefacts all across this area, they all turn out to be similar. They're not one sort of site or another sort of site, or campsites or task-specific sites, or whatever sort of archaeological terminology you want to use. There seem to be localities that are visited more often, but the whole landscape was used. So we can think about the distribution of stone artefacts as a testament to the generations of people who've moved through this landscape and left the signs of their journeying on the land. To borrow the Napoli metaphor of the flow of water through the landscape, the distribution of artefacts is a sign of the flow of the people through the land. These signs can be read by archaeologists who can use them to interpret technological organisation, the social organisation that produced them, the tasks that were performed, by traditional owners who recognise those stone artefacts as the tangible evidence of the connection to country left by their ancestors. And of course, the ancestors themselves were perfectly aware of the stone artefacts left in the land. These traces of previous occupation would have been instantly recognisable to them, and they would indicate to them a landscape that was socialised and familiar. And they also valued the items that were left behind by their ancestors as sources of raw material themselves. And in fact, we have plenty of evidence that people used to move around raw material and leave them in particular places for future use. If you remember our first example, and the unique little assemblage in the rock shelter of the core and the hammer stones left there for future use. So just zooming in on another locality in the Christmas Creek area and how we might approach a close reading of the landscape in this compliance context and its associated the landscape and its associated archaeology to better interpret the recorded sites. as a related complex rather than just a collection of individual site polygons. And again, I stress that this is an archaeologist's eye view, but as is probably evident, it's strongly influenced by Aboriginal ideas about landscape. This landscape is also in Napoli country. The red triangle at the middle of the circle is a rock shelter, and here within the circle we're looking very closely at the landscape within a 1 kilometre radius of the shelter. The rock shelter was test excavated and it was used within the last 1,000 years or so. The shelter's on a creek line close to some rock holes. Just upstream of the shelter, about 500 metres away, is a soak. This has large artefact scatters on small rises around it. There are a number of other small artefact sites, mostly on the creek line, but there's also a group of sites on the east of the creek, about a kilometre from the rock shelter. And several of these artefact scatters on the eastern side are associated with an area where chalcedony was being quarried and processed. There's also a small scatter where banded iron was flaked, and a chert quarry just outside the circle to the north. The two yellow squares are stone features. One is a small shelter with one of its two entrances walled off, and the traditional owners on the survey interpret this for hunting. The second is a small walled niche, and the traditional owners interpret this as a storage place. The black dots are isolated artefacts. There are quite a few of these. A number of them down the creek line, but there are also others. The coloured dots are grinding stones. Some of these are found with other stone artefacts, but there are a couple of isolated ones too. This is an interpretation of this place as a taskscape, viewing the landscape not as a map with a series of unconnected dots on it, but as a locality where a whole collection of related activities took place, and where we can analyse and interpret the sites that we observe as a tangible evidence of people moving through and living in this landscape. Unsurprisingly, there's plenty of evidence of activity along the creek, especially around the soak, where there was shade and water. And the grindstones indicate that food processing was probably an important activity in this area. And we would suggest that, unsurprisingly, the creek was a clear focus of habitation. Well, it's not one single focus, it's a spread out focus on the creek. There were stone sources in this landscape too, and so stopping to collect and process these raw materials as people moved around was an important activity. We could go on speculating about this landscape and how the archaeological materials fit into and are organised by the shape of the land and the activities performed there. And no doubt there are other overlays that traditional owners would put on this landscape as well, which we could use to fill out the picture. The one thing we cannot do is revisit it and follow the people who walked this land before us, because this landscape, like so many others, is now utterly transformed. Fortunately, we have the site register. We have some site records. Many of the artefacts were salvaged. So we could look into some of the aspects of this landscape a little bit further, and we can use archaeological techniques to do this. But the place itself is now lost to us. Thank you.